You're tuned into The Wire. 1 hour of current affairs and analysis starting now.
Welcome to The Wire on this wet, bedraggled Thursday. I'm Simon. Over the next hour, we've got an interview-packed show and a feature for you. Around 12:25, you'll hear Gary Paslow's view on the current state of the Ports of Auckland strike. Being the president of the Maritime Union representing the port workers, Gary's been in the thick of things, you could say. And then I'll be taking a call from Richard Pearson, the chairman of the Ports of Auckland, to get his side of the story. To finish the show, you'll hear a special report from Laura Greenaway on We Are the University, the activist group that opposes the direction Auckland University is going in. But first up, I've got Counterclockwise with Selwyn Manning. This week we're talking all things Nick Smith, the man, his politics, and how his resignation from Cabinet affects the governing National Party. But first, let's play this.
Our Wire.
Welcome, Selwyn. How you doing?
Yeah, not too bad, Simon. How are things there?
Oh, good, good. Now, how big a deal is Nick Smith's resignation?
It is an extremely big deal. If you put yourself into the national-led government's shoes, Nick Smith is a significant player in that top five of the intellectual grunt, if you like, right at the top of the cabinet order in the beehive. And what I mean by that is Nick Smith, as a new MP, came in his mid-20s, already had a doctorate under his belt, and he brought already at that time, back in 1990, a new fresh face, but also a new style of intellectual grunt. His political faction, if you like, sat very well in with the other new incumbent people, MPs that came in that wave. Bill English, Roger Selwyn, and the minister of the current minister of health,
Tony Ryle.
Tony Ryle. Now, those four, they were labelled the Brat Pack because they were the new up-and-coming movers and shakers of the National Party way back in the 1990s when Jim Bolger's team, had, as Prime Minister back then, had just came in to replace the Labour government from the 1980s. Now, with that faction, it was seen as a more progressive politics kind of styled faction, this Brat Pack. And once again, it worked with the old Conservatives and the ideologues, the right-wing ideologues led by Ruth Richardson at that time. And it kind of formed a politics that was, like I mentioned, progressive, but was able to work within the Conservatives, like the Jim Bolger camp, and which Bill English became quite strongly aligned to, and those right-wing ideologues that Ruth Richardson at the time and Jenny Shipley were driving through policy. Nick Smith very much learned his politics during that period. As he became a minister in the latter stages of that Bolger-led government, and he certainly, in opposition, developed those strong orator skills and the strong ability to present rhetoric in the debating chamber. Now, what we saw in the new John Key-led government is Nick Smith coming to the fore, being able to demonstrate a strong hand, if you like, and a strong ability to be able to turn the National Party's ideology into law and into regulation. And that transformation of that type of idea or an ideology into practice was a skill that he particularly had, Simon.
Do you think that the Prime Minister is ruining his resignation?
Absolutely. I mean, this, in my view, and I wrote a column on livenews.co.nz about this, that it really rocks the national government here. It's got a legislative plan. It's got a significant strategic plan that it wants to deliver in this 3-year term. It's always unsure whether or not it would win, a third term at the end of this. It's looking good in the polls at the moment, but politics, anything can happen. We've got a stronger Labour Party, a stronger opposition bench that chews into that. John Key knows that they've got to put the hammer down. They've got to put the foot on the accelerator, to put a pun out there and really get National Party's view of how New Zealand should be out there in the legislative reform package that it's putting before the Parliament and into law.
Selwyn, how important was Nick Smith to conveying that view? What role did he play here?
Well, like we know, he was the Minister of ACC, and this is what got him into a lot of trouble. He was that up until the last election. Then what he did is he was brought into local government after Rodney Hyde didn't make it back into Parliament. So Nick Smith picked up that local government ministerial portfolio. That is hugely significant from the point of view that the National-led government, the John Key-led government, is only on the 19th of March, so only a matter of days ago, put out a statement announcing major reform of local government throughout New Zealand. And it's called, this statement was really there with Nick Smith's name all over it. And I'll just before we move on to another point, like only on the 19th of March, Nick Smith put out the statement and he says, these reforms are part of the government's broader program for building a more productive, competitive economy and a better public service. Now, what he's talking about there is the National-led government, John Key's government, were using Nick Smith to put a firm hand on all the councils right throughout New Zealand and say, you people cannot put up rates willy-nilly. We will tell you if it's good or if it's bad. We are intending on having centralised control to a degree, or governance control over what you do. That's huge. That's a huge difference in New Zealand.
Who's going to pick up the baton then?
Well, what we know is overnight Jerry Brownlee has picked it up in a transformational kind of role. We do not know yet if Jerry Brownlee is going to become the new Minister of Local Government, but we do know that he is the one who's gone in as the Mr. Fix-It as Nick Smith exits. Now, you could expect that Nick Smith will have a role in bringing a lot of his intellectual ability to be able to pull off this legislative change to support any new minister in the portfolio. But once again, he's out of the executive, meaning the beehive, the cabinet, etc., etc. He isn't even able to address question time in Parliament, where his oratory and his skill of theatre was in evidence there time and time again. He is relegated to only really being able to speak in Parliament during the general debate, which hardly anyone notices and no one really pays any attention to.
We've seen ministers resign before. Like I'm thinking of Ruth Dyson actually. Resigned obviously. Basically driving. Now it's pretty serious. Is this the end for Nick?
Yeah, it is. I think it is the end. If you look at what National has done in the last 10 years, it's been out there, it's identified up-and-coming, bright, new, younger people. And they're basically the new 2001 version, the 21st century version of the Brat Pack. You've got Nikki Kay is out there, for example, who could easily come into the executive in some sort of minor role in the first instance and then roll into being a very significant minister. You've got Simon Bridges, who's got a credible track record already out there when he worked in law. He brings all of that youth and the intellectual skills across. It would be an opportunity missed if John Key didn't elevate one of those two into the executive in some way. And when I say executive, I mean anything like an associate minister, anything like that, and then elevate one of the others up into the Minister of Local Government and certainly a Minister of Environment, which is vacated by Nick Smith's resignation.
So with Nick Smith, Patrick Garrett, TV3, said he was too weak to continue. Is there someone out there, like you're saying that Jerry Brownlee's picking up some of the mantle, but he's got a pretty firm hand, hasn't he? I mean, this new Brat Pack you talk about, are they tough politicians?
Well, they're very savvy politicians. They haven't been tested in the cut and thrust of ministerial politics, which is quite different to being a backbencher. So that's where they would be edged, arguably, if you were looking at all of those new ones that are sitting there in the backbenches, and you were John Key, you'd have to notice Simon Bridges, you'd have to notice Nikki Kay. They hold significant electorates. They've won decisively in those electorates. They also bring an intellectual grunt that ought to be rewarded. They are not new on the block at the last election. They've been there already for 3 years and almost 3.5 years. So, you'd look at those, bring them into the lower down areas of the lower down areas of the executive and the lower part of the pecking order, and then you would elevate one of the mid-placed ones up to do the job that Nick Smith has done. But I've got to emphasise that, Nick Smith was very much a strong hand on what he was doing, and in some ways probably too clever for his own good, like you can see, which is what has come to pass in the last week. But the problem with National, the problem with John Key's cabinet at the moment, is all the ministers that are worth their salt, that are doing major regulatory reform or legislative reform are already flat out busy. Like you alluded to just before, Jerry Brownlee's already got a firm hand in a big job in Christchurch. To put him into a major reform package like local government, what that does is send a signal. One, is he going to be taking his eye off Christchurch? Well, they can't afford to do that. And two, it shows that they are already stretched for talent in the top five. Certainly, top five's looked after, but beyond the top five, they're certainly giving the impression that they're light on talent. They could put Kate Wilkinson in there, but she's already got a big job over some legislation that's going to be coming through on the food bill, for et cetera, et cetera. And she is not really any kind of intellectual kind of replacement for what Nick Smith had in that cabinet.
Well, will the Prime Minister be worried that whoever he puts here is going to be an easy target for David Shearer?
I think, the problem that John Key's lot have got this term is that it's not just the Labour leader, irrespective of who that would be. David Shearer, I think, has certainly shown that he brings an ordered and an ideal to the debate and certainly to question time. But you've got Winston Peters sitting there as well and leading New Zealand First. You've got Russell Norman leading the Greens. And on the far left you've got Hone Harawira, representing, just himself as the Mana Party representative. But certainly Peters, David Shearer, and Russell Norman bring a huge amount of their own intellectual grunt to that opposition pack. The National Party has really been reeling to try and actually sort out a lot of problems that it's had this year. It has not looked solid. It has not looked streamlined. It's looked, in some cases, in disarray. And that is largely due to two things. One, the opposition working as a pack and as a team, Labour included, and also the media, having been burnt last year by that, John Key sicking the cops onto media via that Tea Party kind of tape thing, has put them in a position when they're thinking, okay, mate, we're not going to give you a soft ride this time round. We're going to go and make sure we do our job this time.
Do you think it solve some ideological issues maybe for the party? Was Nick Smith an impediment to the party travelling in a direction it wanted to, or how did he fit in there?
No, he's a progressive politics kind of guy, so he can fit in. The factions and the ideology has moved. It used to be dominated by the centrist Bill English. You had Simon Power, who was an up-and-coming potential replacement for John Key at one stage, but he's gone from Parliament. All those centrist ones have pretty much gone, and Bill English is really much an island on his own. As Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, the factions have moved away from him, ironically. The new factions are that right economic-leaning kind of economic liberal pack that is led by Stephen Joyce, and John Key is amongst those. Nick Smith coming out of it doesn't alter that balance in any way. What it does do is it stops Bill English from basically having one of his Brat Pack members that is able and has the skills to bridge that divide that could be seen to be there. The other thing is that from an ideological point of view, when it shifted its pace after the last election, and it said, okay, we're going to go for broke. We're not going to be the moderate centrist. Well, John Key said they would be, but by their own track record, they're showing they're not intending on being a moderate centrist type of government this time around. They're going more for the jugular, more for less government, drill down on the public service, and make it very, very thin on the ground in that sense. So that requires skilled handling, and that's where they will notice Nick Smith not there.
Great. Well, Selwyn, that's all we've got time for this week. No doubt this will keep unfolding. It'll be interesting to see who fills Nick Smith's shoes, and we'll talk again sometime soon.
Okay, Simon.
All right, thanks.
95 BFM, Under the Radar, and Velvet Time.